Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphan Last, aka Skylar Madison, and today I've decided to ignore a statement
of the past.
Which is to say, somewhat recently I finished a Galaxy's Edge fan art piece and said that
this was the last piece of Galaxy's Edge fan art that I'd do for a really long time.
But what I didn't anticipate at that point was just how freaking depressed I'd get in the next coming weeks. And sometimes in order to pull myself out of depression, I just need to draw a few things that just fascinate me. And Galaxy's Edge is just one of those things that fascinates me, pure and simple. It all started when I was just bumbling around on the internet with no real goal, which happens from time to time. Well, anyhow, it's during one of these sorts of relatable, brain-dead moments when I came upon a piece of Star Wars concept imagery. It was a picture of Kylo Ren force choking someone, and that got me to do some
quick research.
I jumped onto the Googler, and I typed in
Darth Vader choking people.
And sure enough, pretty close to the top of the search was a very similar image of Darth Vader choking somebody, just not with the Force. The scene was from A New Hope, and the scene in either image seemed actually somewhat similar. The environment, the setting, all of that. It seemed really similar. But they made Kylo Ren's pose a bit more dynamic. But that also got me thinking. It got me thinking the thought,
what would be Galaxy's Edge's take on this sort of imagery?
That's what I was thinking. And seeing as I'm something like one of the 6 people out there in the world drawing anything pertaining to Galaxy's Edge and, fan art towards it, kind of trying to flesh out the visual storytelling and the world of it, since I'm one of those 6 people or so, if I want to see something like that and what it would look like, I just have to be the one to illustrate the image myself, which is fine.
It's a dirty job, but somebody's gotta do it.
The googly image search with
Darth Vader choking someone.
I made sure to make the scene in my image look somewhat similar to that picture, with the corridors and all that laid out fairly similar. Escape pod looking ports on the walls, something kind of like that. I also decided to make this even more with a wide shot, like just kind of get the camera even further away. How can I do that and make it more dynamic? What if it was 3-point perspective, just slightly tilted up at the scene? I wanted it to look like A New Hope, that's that particular scene from A New Hope, but I wanted it to look cooler when compared to the piece of concept art of Kylo Ren force choking someone. I wanted it looking cooler than all of that. I also got Goth Sullus to be crouched down even more than the Darth Vader and Kylo Ren's depiction of either image. Goth Sullus, in becoming Goth Sullus, was seriously injured to the point where the pain was never too far from Goth Sullus's mind. And so I figured that would influence the way that Goth Sullus would move, a type of movement that's more predatory and on the prowl, more defensive, something along those lines. With the armor and the appearance of Goth Sullus, I wanted to make it look more like the cover art from the book Message for the Dead, and I really feel as though I nailed it on this one. I really nailed it on the head. This depiction of Goth Sullus in my picture here looks exactly like the same armor, the exact same Goth Sullus as was on that book cover, Message for the Dead. It looks like that image. It looks awesome, in my opinion. I love this picture. In general, the goal with this image was to illustrate something somewhat inspired by Star Wars, something influenced by Star Wars, but not something that just looks like it's ripping it off. And so, something that's fairly common to see in Star Wars are vertical, really long, round lights on walls, and most of those lights are staggered from one another in different courses, almost like a brick pattern or something like that. These sorts of lights on the walls that are staggered and, elongated oval looking shapes, they really took visual prominence in Empire Strikes Back, especially when Luke faces off with Darth Vader and gets his hand chopped off and all that.
Spoiler warning for those of you that haven't seen a 30 or 40 or 50-year-old movie.
I really wanted to draw these vertical, round, staggered lights for Galaxy's Edge, but if I did, the look for them it's just so iconic to Star Wars that any usage of them outside of Star Wars would be seen as ripping off Star Wars. light, so I didn't want to do that. So how can I do something similar that's inspired by the same thing, okay? That was something that was a question that was posed to me. In the initial sketch, I just drew out a bunch of octagons, kind of like an octagonal grid or something. Maybe something kind of like a beehive. Maybe that would look kind of cool. And just told myself I'll figure out a better way of laying all of this out and fleshing it out in the image as I move along through the image. And you know, from rough draft to final draft, all of that. I'll figure it all out. And ultimately, I was right. That was the right approach to take, because I didn't wind up using that grid of octagons or honeycomb-looking structure for the lights on the walls and stuff like that. I didn't use any of that, because it dawned on me, what if the dynamic thing about the lights on the walls in Galaxy's Edge wasn't that they're really long, round, staggered lights? What if they were framed with these edges that change direction every 15 degrees or so? That's already something that's fairly popular, a trend in designing things with slice operations when designing something that's a sci-fi prop when you're doing 3D modeling. That's already pretty popular. Framing things with 15-degree cuts, alternating 15-degree cuts. And so framing the lights with something like that seemed totally reasonable to me. And what if those lights were just a vertical beam of light that go from ceiling to floor, and it's the alternating 15-degree framing of the lights that makes them compelling? What if that's the interesting thing to the design with these lights on the wall? Maybe that could work. And so I tried it out for this image. Let me know if you feel like it works. I feel like it does. But then again, I could be wrong. I was wrong once, and then I decided never to do it ever again. A few months ago, I drew a piece of Galaxy's Edge fan art of Tyrus Rex cleaning his guns and generally doing maintenance on his guns and all that. When I was working on that particular image, that particular picture, I was posed with a question: what does the interior of the Obsidian Crow look like, which is Tyrus Rex's ship of choice, which of course led me to just
googly the Millennium Falcon's interior.
And I quickly got frustrated with the image, because even though the camera angle on that particular piece of fan art that I was working on back then, it wasn't showing off too much of the interior, I couldn't help but get irritated with myself and the image. So often we think we know what things in our imagination look like, but when the time comes to deliver, when push comes to shove, sometimes we just draw a blank, and instead of producing something completely awesome, unique, and new, or with at least one cool new idea, we produce something that's just somewhat just derivative. And I felt like the interior to the Obsidian Crow in that Galaxy's Edge fan art piece that I drew a few months ago wound up looking believable, but ultimately looked nothing like how I would want the interior of the Obsidian Crow or the interior to any spaceship inside of Galaxy's Edge to look like. For example, like there's one particular design concept that exists inside of Star Wars that I would imagine would exist also inside of Galaxy's Edge. If you look at any interior shot for Star Wars, you'll notice that next to every sci-fi door, there's a small computerized panel. That panel has physical buttons. These are Star Wars images, or Star Wars movie sets, basically, which means the visual storytelling was initiated back in 1977, okay? The whole visual world was created with that mindset, that world back then, viewing like what would the future look like. And so that's how those computerized panels with physical buttons came out to look like. That's why they look like that. And I imagine the very idea of them trying to film people using something like touchscreens would have been too much for them at the time, and not just for them to film it, but just for them to even conceive of the idea of people using a touchscreen interface and that being useful in any way. So yeah, that sort of thing would have never even occurred in George Lucas's mind, having touchscreen interfaces next to every door. I think the only people that came close to predicting touchscreens, kind of somewhat close to the time period that Star Wars was created, it would have been Star Trek: The Next Generation. which released in 1987. There's a 10-year gap from the creation of Star Wars, Star Wars A New Hope, to Star Trek The Next Generation. So I guess maybe Star Trek The Next Generation predicted touchscreen interfaces the best. But regardless, the more and more I thought about it, it seemed like the computerized panels next to every door for Galaxy's Edge should probably be a touchscreen interface. And that got me thinking how useful that would be. If you didn't have any mobile device handy in your pockets or something along those lines, you could just walk over to any wall with a touchscreen interface, or next to any door with a touchscreen interface, because they would be commonplace in the interior of a spaceship. I imagine that you'd log in, have access to all of your applications, and depending on your clearance level on the ship, you'd be able to tie yourself into engineering, the bridge, to the weapon systems, or whatever else that you'd have clearance for. From any touchscreen device on the ship, you'd probably be able to do that. Maybe even FaceTime with someone all the way across the ship. I don't know. Little ideas like that kind of start popping into my head. In my original sketch of this picture, I took a particular idea nearly to completion. You'll notice that near the floor to the right and left corridor, I put these little tubes that connect to the wall and to the floor, and I suppose that would work, I guess, if this were Star Wars. I mean, I imagine Star Wars had quite a bit of tubing that would just randomly connect into a wall and then into the ceiling, or into the wall and into the floor and stuff. I mean, that would work if this was a Star Wars picture. I just don't think that works with Galaxy's Edge. I even received a critique about these little tubes from a friend of mine, saying that they don't fit in with the existing science fiction environment that I had already created. And so I decided to erase them. Of course, there's varying degrees of retro versus predictive science fiction, and visual storytelling that's retro or predictive. But having those tubes there seemed to be a bit too retro. Those tubes would have looked like something science fiction
if today were the 1970s.
And ultimately, when I'm trying to flesh out the visual world of Galaxy's Edge, I'm always trying to match my visual narrative and techniques to what I'm trying to predict is what the authors would want the visual storytelling to be. I'm trying to match my storytelling to match what I think the author's storytelling should be visually, as best as I can, without knowing them all too well and all that. But since we're on the topic of retro versus predictive storytelling, be it visually or not, just generally with science fiction, an example of too much retro for Galaxy's Edge would be something like what's in the first 3 episodes of the original Lost in Space series, when they need to check their computer banks. And so instead of them checking their hard drive to, check what's in their files, they actually pull out a massive reel of film and look through all of these reels of tape in order to look through the files in their computer. That's super retro sci-fi. Something like that, I feel definitely wouldn't fit inside of Galaxy's Edge unless it's another one of those weird through the looking glass moments where you're not sure if the narrative is describing things literally or maybe figuratively. Literally speaking, something retro like that wouldn't fit. If it was something that's more figuratively speaking, as in similar to the confused ramblings of a drug-addled and confused mind describing things, then sure, people can look through their computer banks with reels of tape inside of Galaxy's Edge, because the author of these events has already been established as being unreliable or high, or going through something that's between the physical and spiritual world of Galaxy's Edge, or something along those lines. Those are the only situations where looking up files on reels of tape might apply, if we're dealing with things that are kind of otherworldly, okay? Like Galaxy's Edge has done stuff like that. Hell, they could actually do something similar to Star Trek's Q Continuum, and under that context, any absurd retro idea could fit in Galaxy's Edge, but only under the context that retro technology relates to something similar to what's inside of the Q Continuum. But, another comparative thing with retro storytelling, something that could fit inside of Galaxy's Edge. By and large, the idea of Apollo inside of Battlestar Galactica walking across the flight deck, walking over to a wall, and then just grabbing a phone, a landline, off the wall, and actually talking to another landline phone, talking to the captain across the ship. I can actually see that happening in Galaxy's Edge, but only in a very specific set of circumstances, possibly. What if the story is following the Republic Marines instead of the Legion? Well, the Marines don't have LCOM. Therefore, their communications might be able to get compromised. So maybe the Marines have more landline sort of communication because they might want more secure forms of communication, even if that means reverting backward with the technology used during wartime. I mean, I think that might actually be something that could have validity inside of the Galaxy's Edge universe. But in general, what retro science fiction storytelling does is it grabs existing technology, be it old or modern technology, and then imagining that particular device as if it's on steroids so that it fits in a science fiction world, regardless of if it would or not. In a way, retro storytelling can be extremely rewarding in that the immediate consuming audience will view it soon after, and they'll be able to relate with the technology quite a bit more. Actually, they'll be able to relate with it 100%. But just like using reels of tape to look through your computer banks a few decades down the road, the story might get bogged down with too much retro storytelling to the point where people think the story is kind of stupid, like the first 3 episodes of Lost in Space, you know? That does get to the point to where people will start thinking the story is kind of stupid. So you're kind of creating a shelf life for your story if you use retro technology inside of your story, whether it be it, you know, through the narrative or visually. A benefit to retro storytelling is that it creates defined limitations to the technology, and that's not bad for a story. Star Wars has some retro storytelling, be it random tubes connecting to weird places on the movie set here and there, but more obviously the deflector dish on the Millennium Falcon is pretty much a radar dish. Either a big round or big rectangular radar dish. That's basically what the deflector dish is on the Millennium Falcon. Now, back when I was a kid watching Star Wars, when it was still relatively new, I thought nothing of that radar dish other than it was cool. Radar dishes were cool. They were state of the art. I remember visiting friends around that time period, and some of them not only had a radar dish, but some of them had a radar dish that was something like 2,000 cubic feet big or something like that. They were huge. I used to wonder if those big radar dishes were being used not only to provide hundreds of channels for their TV, but was it also being used by NASA somehow? Would you be able to get some sort of discount for letting NASA use your radar dish? Is it possible for NASA to use them? Would they even need them? Is this supplying hundreds of channels to the entire city block? I don't know. I was something like 7 years old or something when I saw these enormous radar dishes in people's backyards. I also used to wonder,
am I getting infected with some sort of radiation just by standing next to it? Would standing inside of the house somehow protect me from it?
I used to think things like this. Of course, I was young. I was like 7 years old. Had no idea. But these days, if someone has anything that looks like a satellite dish or a radar dish or whatever, it's probably only something like 1 to 2 cubic feet and in a place you'd never notice. And so when I look at the Millennium Falcon's design and that deflector dish on it, and it resembles a radar dish or something like that, these days I can't help but ask the question,
why would that be on there?
Those are the sorts of things that I'd try to keep out of Galaxy's Edge designs, and I'd go more for a predictive form of storytelling. And by that, what I mean is something a bit more like Gene Roddenberry and his form of storytelling and usage of technology, or something kind of like Jules Verne's type of storytelling. These are two creative authors that created a narrative, a story that predicted all sorts of future technology. And Gene Roddenberry, Jules Verne, they're on par with one another as far as I'm concerned. Some people call our smartphones today the same sort of device as what they use for Star Trek's communicator, which is fine. I mean, there are some differences, such as the Star Trek communicator is a self-sufficient device, and it's able to communicate with a signal that's instantaneous, and its reach is something like from the center of a general, like the average solar system to the very border of that solar system, and it's able to do that without satellites or anything like that. It doesn't need a Wi-Fi signal either. Whereas if the satellite network were to go down and all the Wi-Fi were to go out, our smartphones would just be paperweights that would be occasional flashlights. So they're not quite the same device, but they are very, very similar in how they're used. But Star Trek did present the very first concept or depiction of CDs, DVDs, and generally, since so much of daily life makes everything so mundane, it's kind of hard to recall which ideas they were, but I can somewhat recall more than 20 things here and there throughout my life that have come straight out of Star Trek or a Jules Verne book, and I can definitely see that these ideas were made into a reality, into the modern day. Real products and services in the modern world. And generally, as I draw Galaxy's Edge stuff, be it fan art or officially, I think I'd want to go more the predictive route to the design philosophy. Less retro, more predictive. I think that's the better approach. And so, here we can see the final image coming up onto the screen right now, and damn, it looks fancy! It looks fancy! That looks so stinking cool! I really like it. It came out perfect as far as I'm concerned. Anyways, guys, that pretty much concludes it for this video. If you guys enjoyed it, please feel free to like, share, and subscribe. And if you guys would like to get more notifications from me, feel free to join my Discord server. A link to my Discord server is in the video description below. If you'd like to support this channel, there's an image of a t-shirt in the upper right corner of the screen. It leads to my Teespring. Any support with the purchase of a t-shirt would be much appreciated. And if you've enjoyed this content and would like to see more, feel free to click on anything else that's appearing on the screen right now. Thank you very much for your time.